While Donald Trump was issuing ultimatums and threatening Canada with sweeping tariffs, something happened that almost no one in Washington anticipated. Canada didn't respond with retaliatory tariffs. They didn't ban exports. They didn't issue dramatic threats or hold press conferences. Instead, they took a step that proved far more damaging to the American economy. Canada quietly withdrew from the voluntary supply chain coordination agreements that have kept North American manufacturing running smoothly for more than 70 years. Within hours, the consequences began cascading through the U.S. industrial system in ways no amount of political messaging could contain. This was never a trade dispute that could be resolved with a tweet or a press briefing. It was a collision between political recklessness and economic reality, and it unfolded far faster than the administration expected. Automotive plants in Michigan and Ohio received notices that critical component shipments from Canada were being delayed indefinitely. Not canceled, not banned, just delayed in ways that completely destroy modern production schedules. In a just-in-time manufacturing system with virtually no inventory buffers, a delay of even a few days might as well be a shutdown. Cars cannot be built without parts. When those parts stall at the border, assembly lines stop, and tens of thousands of workers are sent home as paychecks evaporate. Construction firms across the United States soon realized that Canadian steel and lumber shipments were no longer clearing customs on the timelines their contracts were built around. Projects worth billions of dollars faced sudden delays that triggered penalty clauses, cost overruns, and cascading failures across entire development portfolios. Energy markets reacted almost immediately as traders grasped a simple but destabilizing reality. Guaranteed minimum flows of Canadian oil and natural gas were no longer guaranteed. Supply hadn't stopped, but the assumption of reliability vanished overnight, and that uncertainty alone was enough to inject volatility into pricing models that depend on stability above all else. This crisis wasn't triggered by a technical dispute or a misunderstanding. It was triggered by an ultimatum. The Trump administration presented Canada with what it described as a final demand: restrict exports of critical materials unless American companies were granted preferential access at below-market prices. In practical terms, the United States demanded that Canada sell its natural resources at a financial loss to satisfy a political narrative in Washington. This wasn't about emergency shortages or market stabilization. It was about forcing a sovereign country to subsidize American industries by surrendering economic value that belonged to Canadian workers and Canadian shareholders. Canadian officials understood immediately that compliance wasn't merely bad economics. It was existential. Agreeing to those terms would have set a precedent that Canada's sovereignty could be overridden whenever political pressure in Washington made it convenient. That was the line Canada refused to cross. And the moment it refused, the fragility of the American production system became impossible to hide. This is where the administration's misunderstanding of modern economics became painfully clear. Size does not equal leverage in an integrated supply chain. Control over critical inputs at strategic choke points often matters far more than GDP or market size. And Canada sits directly on those choke points: energy, minerals, automotive components, construction materials. These are not inputs the United States can easily replace, not in weeks, not in months, and in some cases not without massive capital investment that takes years. The ultimatum was issued as if Canada had no real choice, as if economic asymmetry alone guaranteed submission. But that assumption ignored a basic truth of modern manufacturing. It is a fragile choreography where the absence of a single component can idle an entire facility employing thousands of workers. As disruption spread, something unusual began happening in corporate boardrooms. Executives who had remained quiet during previous trade threats began making frantic calls to Congress and the White House, not to argue ideology, but to explain operational reality. Factories would shut down within days. Tens of thousands of workers would be furloughed. And competitors in Europe and Asia, untouched by this self-inflicted chaos, would permanently capture market share American firms would never recover. These warnings weren't abstract. They were backed by hard data. Inventory counts, production timelines, contractual obligations that could not be met. The numbers showed how little margin for error exists when a trusted supplier suddenly becomes unreliable. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued emergency statements. Manufacturing associations released projections showing hundreds of thousands of jobs at immediate risk. Industry groups that usually avoid public confrontation began demanding a reversal before irreversible damage occurred. At that point, the cost of treating trade policy as political theater became impossible to ignore. When a factory stops, there is no narrative that restarts it. When a worker is sent home without pay, there is no slogan that covers the mortgage. When energy prices spike because supply certainty disappears, consumers feel it immediately in their heating bills and at the gas pump. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that it follows a familiar pattern. Threats issued without exit strategies. Tariffs on China that ended with American farmers needing bailouts. Border threats against Mexico that nearly shut down automotive supply lines before business pressure forced a retreat. But Canada is different. The integration is deeper. The reliance is more absolute. And the political will to submit does not exist in Ottawa. That combination creates a crisis that cannot be managed with bluster or last-minute deal-making. As real economic harm began materializing, cracks appeared inside Trump's own coalition. Republican senators from affected states demanded immediate resolution. Labor unions warned of imminent mass layoffs. Business leaders who once praised toughness began quietly distancing themselves. Not out of principle, but because balance sheets were bleeding and shareholders wanted answers. This is where the performance of strength collides with the substance of governance. Dominance that produces economic collapse is not strength, it is failure. The deeper damage extends far beyond this immediate standoff. Canada's response sent a message not just to Washington, but to every American ally watching closely. Economic integration with the United States now carries political risk that cannot be managed through traditional diplomacy alone. Once that lesson is learned, it doesn't disappear. Companies adjust supply chains. Governments diversify trade relationships. Investment flows shift toward jurisdictions where policy predictability still exists. And quietly, the world begins building economic systems that rely less on American reliability. Reliability is the true currency of power in global markets, and it is being squandered in real time. What we are witnessing is not just a dispute between two governments. It is the exposure of a structural vulnerability that always existed but had never been tested at this scale. An economy that assumed cooperation would always hold, even as it elected leaders willing to weaponize that cooperation, was bound to face consequences. What makes this moment especially destabilizing for Washington is that there is no clean exit. Escalation accelerates the damage. Retreat undermines the political identity built on never backing down. Both options carry costs that can no longer be hidden from the public. Factories closing, projects stalling, and living costs rising are not abstract metrics. They are lived realities that erode political support. The most lasting effects may come after the headlines fade. American companies are already redesigning supply chains to reduce exposure to political volatility, even at higher cost. Redundancy is replacing efficiency. Inventory buffers are replacing just-in-time precision. Long-term investment is shifting toward environments where rules are stable. Once those decisions are made, they rarely reverse. The integrated North American economy that took generations to build begins to fragment quietly, through thousands of small recalculations rather than dramatic announcements. Canada understands this dynamic, which is why it is accelerating efforts to diversify trade, deepen ties with Europe and Asia, and ensure that no future ultimatum can carry the same systemic threat. Other U.S. allies are learning the same lesson. If Washington is willing to issue existential economic ultimatums to its closest neighbor, no ally can assume immunity. None of this was inevitable, The supply chains didn't break because of natural disaster or unavoidable crisis. They broke because political theater was elevated above stewardship, because complexity was treated as weakness, and because dominance was pursued without regard for the integrated systems that sustain prosperity. The people paying the price are not the architects of the policy. They are workers sent home from idle plants, small businesses stalled by missing materials, families facing higher energy costs. The fundamental question now facing the United States is not whether it can force Canada back to the table. It is whether American leadership can relearn the discipline required to manage power responsibly in a world where leverage cuts both ways. Because unpredictability masquerading as toughness ultimately drives partners away, and strength without restraint becomes self-sabotage. Canada's refusal made that reality visible in the clearest possible terms. And once that truth is exposed, it doesn't disappear when the headlines move on.